Welcome, everybody, to our Tower Center monthly seminar. This is the last seminar of the academic year. It's been a huge success once again, and we're really, really pleased to have Bethany Albertson from UT serve as our last participant in the seminar series. We will start up again in September. We've already got a number of these set up, so we look forward to seeing you again in the fall. But before then, we've got this fabulous discussion today. Dr. Albertson tells me this is her first time at SMU, her first time at the Tower Center. So welcome to SMU, welcome to Dallas. Her topic today, as you can see, is anxious politics, and it has to do with the relationship between anxiety and what it means to be a citizen today. There's certainly no shortage of anxiety in Dallas. I haven't been here that long. I've been here about 18 months, and since I've been here, there's been Ebola, which you've written about, and which has certainly been a source of anxiety for folks. There's also twisters, as in this week, as in tornadoes, the thing that causes my mother to call from California 2 or 3 times a week. She's more anxious than I am about these things, but she certainly is anxious about it. There's also anxiety over terrorism. Things like the Garland shooting a couple of weeks ago. I got a call from a reporter yesterday that asked if anxious parents should keep their children away from graduation ceremonies because of the Garland shooting. And I said, I don't think so. I think that I would be more worried about twisters than I'm about terrorists. But she said, no, it's a real thing, and parents are quite concerned about large public gatherings. So there's another source of anxiety. Obviously, anxiety is much bigger than Dallas. There's anxiety in a lot of different places, and it deeply affects our politics. Right? There is no better person available today to discuss it than our speaker, Dr. Bethany Albertson, University of Texas, who has a PhD from Chicago, has previously been on the faculty at the University of Washington and at Princeton, and will speak to us today about her new book, Anxious Politics, Democratic Citizenship in a Threatening World. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. I have to share my latest inquiry from the press in the realm of anxiety and politics, which was I got asked to comment on Jade Helm. I said no comment. Not touching that one. But let me first begin by noting that my co-author in the project is Shana Kushner-Gadarian. I was visiting at the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton while she was a grad student there. So I was a grad student. I was a pre-doc. And since then, we've just kept up doing study after study together, and a couple of jobs, a marriage, 3 kids, and many, many conference papers, and now, between us 3 kids, not me. I only contributed 1. Now it's a book. We just put the copy edits in on Monday, so it's very exciting to see it come together. I want to begin by noting that anxiety is everywhere. There are so many things in the outside world to be anxious about. This just gives you a smattering of some of the things that cause people to be anxious. And to situate the work theoretically a bit, let me point out that in political science, in my discipline, anxiety and emotion generally had been on the back burner, right? It wasn't what we thought rational people did or good citizens did, right? They made their decisions based on cognition, they made their decisions based on what policies they wanted, and emotion was kind of left over for the uninformed voters, for people who weren't that sophisticated about politics. Now, the past 10, 20 years, emotion has enjoyed this resurgence in political science and in the social sciences more broadly, as people take on a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between emotion and cognition, and note, quite reasonably, that emotion's never absent from our daily lives. So we're part of this kind of resurgence, I guess, of emotion literature, and we're in part responding to the affective intelligence literature. The affective intelligence literature was this first step by Marcus McEwen and co-authors, where they showed us how anxiety is the stop and look emotion. Anxiety is that emotion that tells you all is not well with the world and you need to gather some information. Now, I was talking with Matthew about this on the walk over, Americans are really uninformed about politics. It's an understatement, right? And so, against this backdrop, Marcus and McEwen and co-authors' work gave us this kind of hopeful picture of anxiety. When we're scared, when we're anxious, we seek out information. And in their early work, they showed Americans who are anxious learned about politics. They gathered information, and that was somehow democratically a good thing. They were more informed because of that anxiety. We read that in grad school too, and we were really intrigued by this look at anxiety. But we're also thinking about politicians making us anxious. If you think about our most famous political ads, the Daisy ad, the Willie Horton ad, right? These are ads with strong components of fear, strong components of anxiety. And so we came at this research thinking the affect and intelligence literature shows us these normatively positive consequences for anxiety. But on the flip side, politicians are trying to make us anxious. And we don't think they're doing it in order to make us better democratic citizens. That would be lovely. But we think they're doing it because they think it has some persuasive appeal. They're trying to get something. And so what we're trying to do is reconcile this normatively positive view of anxiety in politics with the practical uses of anxiety. This gives me a chance to the use of fear and anxiety in politics is so widespread, is so common that, Millis and Stephen Colbert, who, oh gosh, is he going to be a loss for me in teaching Intro-American? Because finally somebody made campaign finance fun. But he's able to mock, just how widespread this understanding of politicians using fear to get votes, to persuade people. And so I'm going to start with our theoretical background is that we're looking, there's lots of emotions in politics. Post-tenure, I want to spend some time on some more pleasant emotions, but right now I'm on the negative side. And within the negative side, I'm looking particularly at anxiety. There's also anger, there's sadness, there's disgust. We're focusing in on anxiety. It's an unpleasant, aversive state. It's uncomfortable, right? It's when your palms sweat and your heart beats faster and you're uncomfortable. And our argument is that threat and uncertainty, those uncomfortable feelings, draw you to coping mechanisms. They draw you to coping mechanisms, right? You have to do something with that kind of shook-up feeling. And in particular, we're going to trace anxiety through 3 coping mechanisms. Political information seeking, and this is closest to that affective intelligence literature I opened with. When you're anxious, what do you learn? What type of information do you seek out? Anxious citizens also cope by trusting people, right? When the U.S. is attacked, there's a rally around the flag mechanism, right? We need to trust in our leaders. We need to trust in the government to keep us safe. So trust in government is a really traditional kind of consequence of anxiety. And then attitudes. We think that anxiety will have consequences for the sorts of attitudes we hold, the policies that we support. But to complicate it a bit, I want to point out that we're anxious about all sorts of things. Some of these things we think of as unframed threats, right? The Ebola outbreak. As soon as it happens, you don't need your partisanship, you don't need your trusted elite to tell you to be anxious about that. It's unframed. The harm is widely agreed upon. The harm might be imminent, include bodily harm, death, right? A disease outbreak, a terrorist attack. At its very beginning, this triggers widespread fear and anxiety. On the other hand, there are framed threats. And I'm drawing a really simple distinction here, and you can imagine that it's a continuum and that there's ambiguity between these 2 categories. But framed threats are those in which there's a debated cause of harms. Harms might be delayed. And whether or not you experience anxiety and the consequences of that anxiety might be politically constructed, right? So immigration. Is immigration something that makes your heart beat faster, your palms sweat? Is this something that you think is a bad thing for the country? Or is it something that just doesn't faze you? Right? So immigration is going to be one of our framed threats that we spend quite a bit of time on in the book, and I'll spend quite a bit of time on it in this talk. Climate change. We think of it as a framed threat because if you look at anxiety in the mass public, it's concentrated more on the left. First, this was a nice case because there's this tradition within anxious politics to focus on conservative ideologies, right? This is like John Jost's work, where anxiety benefits conservative parties generally. And we wanted to show that it's not necessarily pushing people in a conservative direction, that there's opportunities. We come at it kind of agnostic in terms of partisanship. We think both parties will scare us when it benefits them politically. The cases we cover in the book are disease outbreaks, immigration, are our two main cases, and they're the ones I'll talk about today. We also, as supplementary cases, bring in climate change and bring in the war on terror. And to give you kind of an overview of the book, we have 7 main studies. The top line are our 3 immigration studies. 2 are knowledge networks, so representative samples. And then on the bottom line, we have our public health studies. UT's campus, we did an H1N1 study. While H1N1, that was happening, and we could take advantage of, it sounds awful, take advantage of anxiety that was on campus at the time. And then the smallpox study was through YouGov. There's a terrorism study and the climate change study. Throughout the talk, I'll be kind of mentioning different ways in which we get at anxiety. It's not a simple thing to manipulate anxiety. Let me just start with that. Okay, so part 1. I'm going to tell you that anxious people engage with information in a way that's different than non-anxious people. We're going to argue, and this is drawn from literature in social and clinical psychology, that anxious people learn, as the affective intelligence literature told us, but that anxious people are drawn towards threatening information. This kind of gives us our first clue as to why politicians might want to make us anxious, right? That it causes us to engage with information in a biased sort of way. So here our manipulation is a bottom-up manipulation. We ask half of the population, when you think about immigration, what makes you worry? Please list everything that comes to mind. And then we tell the control condition, when you think about immigration, what do you think about? Right, so it's just a bottom-up manipulation. We're not giving anybody information. We're just asking people to either generate their own thoughts or their own worries. And when you ask people to generate their own worries, it heightens anxiety in the treatment condition as compared to the control condition. Truth is, when you ask people to list their thoughts about immigration, they'll list some worries as well. So it's in part a tough test of our hypothesis, because we have some anxiety hanging out in the control condition. There's no way that we've found to get people to think about immigration without also causing some anxiety. So here's some examples. When you ask people what their thoughts are on immigration, this is the control condition. You see some innocuous things like this. And you also do see some level of anxiety. We have research assistants go through these and code them for differences. And here's some representative examples from the treatment condition. And then it also takes a nastier turn than that, as you can imagine. Okay, so in order to see how anxious people learn, or how they engage with information, we put them in a constructed information environment. We give them a web page. They're doing this online, and we give them a web page. And in that web page, they have 6 stories, and we say you can read as many stories as you like, or none at all. and we record which stories they look at, in what order, and how much time they spend on each story. There's 2 negative threatening immigration stories, 2 positive or neutral immigration stories, and then because in the real world, if we're anxious about something, we have the opportunity to opt out completely, right? We can just say, look, forget that. I don't want to engage with that. We give them 2 non-immigration stories. And all the stories were pre-tested to be of equal interest to the subject population, and we randomly ordered them. And you can't do this study, by the way, with undergraduates, because do you know what happens when you give undergraduates 6 stories and you say read as many or as few as you like? They read them all. In non-student populations, the mean number of stories is somewhere between 2 and 3. With undergrads, the modal number was 6. The mean was somewhere like 5. And I have to think it's because they assumed they were going to be tested on the stories. Here's the names of the stories. And the subjects got these names, and they could click on them, and each linked to an article of roughly the same size, length, and we're monitoring which stories they click on and in what order. And we think there's 3 opportunities for bias. One is selective exposure. What stories do respondents look at? Beyond that, we're interested in what they remember. So after they do this information search, we ask them, do you remember any of the stories you looked at? And then in an open-ended opportunity, they can share what they remember. We have research assistants code that. And then do they agree or disagree with the stories when they're given the opportunity? So where we're coming at this is to say people aren't blank slates, right? You get anxious, you look at information, and you can disregard it. You can counter-argue, you can dismiss. And what we want to know is ultimately what information do anxious people end up with? Okay, so the first basic finding is that people in the treatment group read a higher proportion of stories about immigration. And this is consistent with the affective intelligence literature, right? You get anxious about something and you seek out relevant information. That makes sense. This would also get you towards the normatively positive portrayal of anxiety in politics. However, when we break apart the positive and negative immigration stories, what you see is the bias is all driven by the negative and threatening stories. So anxious people learn more about immigration, but they learn a particular type of information about immigration. We also find when we look at differences in what people remember, this is what proportion of what you remember was positive or negative about immigration. That bias again shows up, but only in terms of the negative stories. And then when we code whether people are agreeing or arguing with the negative and positive stories, the difference here is only statistically significant when it comes to agreeing with the negative story, and that's driven by the treatment condition, right? That's driven by, the difference between the treatment control and the treatment condition, the anxious condition, is more likely to agree with the negative story. And so the consequence of this 3-step process is that anxious people walk away with a more negative set of information about immigration. And then throughout the book, oh my goodness, can I tell you, there are some very unwieldy mediation models and interaction terms, and I thought about putting it together with the really ugly, ugly tables, and then I thought I could just maybe show you mean differences and tell you some of the more nuances. So I went that route. I hope that's okay. I don't even know how some of them are going to fit in the book. I think they'll probably be a, please see website, and then nobody will ever go to it. Because we're interested in the role that partisanship plays throughout each of these coping mechanisms, we ran the models among Democrats and among Republicans. And what we found was that this first stage, who looks at threatening information. That happened for the Democrats and it happened for the Republicans. It's these second two stages, who remembers threatening information and who agrees with it, that was driven by the Republicans. And we use that finding to kind of interact with the effective intelligence literature again, which tells us that anxious people gather new information and base their decisions on contemporary information, leaving their standing decisions, such as partisanship, behind. And our argument is that we don't ever leave that really behind, that partisanship is going to continually interact with our coping mechanisms. Okay, so that's part one on information seeking. Part two is about trust. Anxious people need to trust. We need to trust in outside actors. Now, we might not turn to political actors. We might trust in non-political actors, but we're going to focus on politics mostly, because for us, the issues that are causing anxiety are political issues. We're going to argue, based on previous literature, that anxious people will trust, and they'll trust experts. They'll trust people who are deemed appropriate and competent to handle the source of anxiety. In the category of framed threats, though, when threats are politically constructed, we're going to argue that partisanship can shape who the experts are. And here we're drawing upon work by Petrosic. Pat Egan has a recent book on this about party ownership and issues. So we're going to say if a party owns the relevant issue, that's going to advantage them when it comes to trust. But let's start with an unframed issue. This is a public health study that we did in regards to smallpox. So we're out of the realm of the bottom-up manipulations of anxiety now. Now we're lying to people, right? We're not drawing upon the anxieties they already have. We're telling them things are happening. And in this study, we tell them there's a smallpox outbreak. It's either 25 years ago or it's right now. It's in Ohio. We can talk about ethics later if you like. Question and answer. This is something we thought about a lot, as you can imagine. Okay, so they get an article that looks like this. Looks like it's drawn from the New York Times. We actually start with a real article, and then we tweak it for our purposes. And you're either getting that this Cleveland, Ohio outbreak of smallpox is happening right now, or it's the 25th anniversary. But that difference allows us to include all the gory details about what smallpox does, so that in both conditions, you're learning about what a dangerous disease this is, but it's in the treatment condition that you have a heightened sense of anxiety. And then the control condition, which I'm not going to show you differences on today. The tougher test is the difference between past and present smallpox. But the control condition was an unrelated issue. And quite sensibly, if you tell people there is a present smallpox outbreak, they have heightened levels of anxiety. That's just to show that we did succeed in raising anxiety levels. And then we give them a list of figures they can trust in if they like. And specifically, it's do you trust them to handle the smallpox outbreak? We wanted variety in terms of how relevant or irrelevant these figures were. And so the first thing I want you to know is these dependent variables were randomly ordered for the subjects. So some people, they got them all in different orders. But here I have them from the most trusted to the least trusted. Okay, this should make you feel kind of good. People are sort of making sense, right? They're most trusting in their doctor, they're least trusting in the IRS.
Or Oprah.
Oh yeah, well I just put that in there because, Oprah has this complicated relationship to public health. And by complicated, I want to say scary. And so I was interested, if you're anxious about a public health threat where people are going to boost their trust in Oprah, and it's not statistically significant. It made me feel better. It's close though. It's close. So yeah, Oprah's more trusted than the Federal Reserve Board. Is that appropriate? I'm not sure. Less trusted than the Department of Homeland Security. Okay. But it's the difference between the past and the present that's really interesting here. When people get anxious about the smallpox outbreak, they become more trusting in the CDC. They become more trusting in FDA and the Department of Homeland Security, HHS, right? We have some further studies, if you're interested, in which we manipulate, for instance, the Surgeon General can be portrayed as a political appointee or as a medical expert, and she's more trusted when she's portrayed as a medical expert, which makes sense. Okay. Here we don't find that partisanship moderates the effect of the anxiety. Of course, partisanship moderates whether you trust Obama or not, right? But it doesn't condition the effect of the anxiety on trust. Now I'm going to move into a framed threat. With a framed threat, immigration, we think that partisanship is going to have big effects in terms of who gets trusted. Here our manipulation is, and if I'm bouncing all over the place with manipulations, I can tell you that that's purposefully done. Manipulating something like anxiety is really, really tough to do, and our argument is that there's no perfect approach, and so you want to do it in kind of as many ways as you can. Okay, for this one, we turn to, I grew up in California, and this was an ad of my youth. And let me tell you, we pre-tested a couple of different anti-immigration ads. It turns out there's a lot of them. This was the one that gave us the cleanest difference in terms of producing anxiety. The manipulation here that I want you to look for is in terms of the music and the visuals. And this is in keeping with, for instance, Ted Breiter's work on campaign ads where they try to heighten anxiety just through threatening visuals and music. You want to keep as much constant across the conditions. So let's see if now it's my turn to feel anxious. Hoping this works.
It's how this country was built. American citizenship is a national treasure, but now rules are being broken. Today, more than 11 million illegal immigrants overwhelm our borders and our hospitals. Illegal immigrants take American jobs. Open borders bring crime and a threat to national security. Illegal immigrants take welfare, healthcare, and education dollars that should go to hardworking Americans. There is a right way to do things and a wrong way. Enough is enough. Say no to illegal immigration.
Okay. And here's the control condition.
It's how most of us got here. It's how this country was built. American citizenship is a national treasure, but now rules are being broken. Today, more than 11 million illegal immigrants overwhelm our borders and our hospitals. Illegal immigrants take American jobs. Open borders bring crime and a threat to national security. Illegal immigrants take welfare, healthcare, and education dollars that should go to hardworking Americans. There is a right way to do things and a wrong way. Enough is enough. Say no to illegal immigration.
Okay, so one of the fun things in my job is to take an ad like that and then pull it apart and put it back together again. You'll note that the voiceover was the same between the two conditions. It's the images that shifted and the music. Then we ask people to rate their trust in randomly ordered figures to handle immigration. Again, the trust is specific. It's not a diffuse trust. It's do you trust this person in regards to this policy area? And the findings I want to share with you, these aren't the means, so I can't show you that in general border control's trusted and the Minutemen aren't trusted. Sorry about that. I could have done it that way here as well. But here what I'm showing you is differences between the treatment and control. So the only difference is the music and the imagery, right? And this is broken apart by Democrats and Republicans. So Jan Brewer, right? whether she's trusted or not trusted. There's no difference for the governor of Arizona on whether you got the treatment or control. That's what those lines are telling you, hanging out around 0. The differences we get are Republicans in the treatment condition are less trusting of Obama than Republicans in the control condition. Republicans in the treatment condition are less trusting of the Democratic Party than Republicans in the control condition. And then, and this is perhaps the most interesting result, both Democrats and Republicans become more trusting of the Republican Party in the treatment condition. This is a finding that we attribute to the owned issues literature that the Republican Party owns, whether they want to or not, right now. Own the issue of immigration. Issue ownership isn't an essential characteristic, right? It doesn't have to be that they'll always own immigration, but it's a fairly steady one, and it takes a while to change. And according to Pat Egan's work, according to people who analyze trusted parties on various issues, the Republicans still own immigration. And so if we make Americans anxious about it, they are the beneficiaries.
Is it immigration or illegal immigration?
The ad?
No, I mean what they own.
Yeah. The ownership questions are...
Immigration is very popular. So.
I know. The ownership ones just say immigration. They don't specify legal or illegal.
Yeah. I'm just saying that.
No, I completely...
You see what I'm saying?
Right. And here the trust questions and our own questions don't specify, although the ad very clearly is invoking illegal. And so our argument is that anxiety boosts trust in experts, but that with framed threats, partisanship shapes who the relevant experts are.
Just a quick interjection on this top point. Is it the people that gravitate towards experts because they know a lot about the threat, or because they're looking for somebody who can do something about it?
That's a good question, and I'm going to give you a hesitant because they... Well, let me tell you the finding, and then you tell me which it fits into. In a follow-up study, we manipulated whether the different figures were offering solutions or whether they were just trying to kind of gin up more anxiety. So we manipulated the rhetoric attached to Jan Brewer, to Barack Obama, to the Democratic Party, etc. And we found, and this is another hopeful finding, I think, for those of us who are anxious about an anxious citizenry, there were higher levels of trust when a policy solution was attached, which we attributed to people are trusting in these experts because they think they can do something about it.
Well, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, it's just sort of going to your doctor and he tells you you've got 6 months to live. Suddenly I care less about his expertise and I want a second opinion.
Right.
I want somebody to tell me good news that I can do something about.
Right. It's not satisfying to, if you tell me I need to be anxious, at some point that has to lead somewhere. Yeah. And then part 3, I just wanted to show you some of our attitudes work when it comes to immigration. Anxiety is going to increase support for policies that we think will protect us from danger. This is another piece of the coping mechanism. And again, parties can try to take advantage of this when they own policy areas. Oh, okay, so this is specific to illegal immigrants. Good. Or nice to have clarity on that. That's my point. Should illegal immigrants have access to, and this is after the ads, either they get the treatment or control version of the ad, they're asked, should they have access to emergency room care, elementary school, Medicaid, food stamps, and state tuition. And what we find is the anxiety-producing version of the ad will depress support for different services. The significant differences are on access to food stamps and Medicaid. In the public health work, when we make people anxious about a smallpox outbreak, we find increased support for protective measures, and sometimes protective measures can have potentially anti-democratic consequences, as we all recently witnessed going through the Ebola scare. And so, again, we want to argue that protection is in part determined by the political context around the issues. And that's where I think that political science has something interesting to say when it comes to emotion in politics, right? We get to bring partisanship into it. And so George Marcus is part of this affective intelligence literature. And this is a quote that's representative, I think, to the positive portrayal. The ability of the press to present us with bad news and to disquiet us, though unpleasant, to serve us well. Right? On the other hand, and this is a quote from Jeb Bush from a while ago, and he was referencing his party's tone on immigration, that it's troubling when people are appealing to people's fears and emotion, rather than trying to get them to look over the horizon for a broader perspective. And this is really the tension we're dealing with in our book. The kind of normatively positive portrayal of anxiety with the strategic and political uses of anxiety in politics. And with that, I will turn to questions.
I'm going to take the prerogative and throw it open. I'm kind of curious.
Oh, thank you.
The notion that anxiety is a coping mechanism sort of makes sense. You get a little bit scared, you desire more information, you want to know what is this thing. But if I understood part of your argument right, particularly anxious people gravitate towards information which reinforces their anxiety. Right? So people who were tremendously scared about a smallpox outbreak would read stories reinforcing that fear, or if they were scared about illegal immigration, they would gravitate towards those stories. It's an odd and sort of paradoxical way of coping. Mm-hmm. You're scared, so you look for information, but you lean to information that makes you more scared. Mm-hmm. Right? Is there a way out of this trap? Or is anxiety leads you into this sort of terrible duel?
That is a wonderful question. Is there a way out of the trap? I don't know. And is it possible that the trap only exists at lower levels of anxiety? It's also possible. It's possible that at some point we get so anxious we just have to disengage, right? We have to turn off. And when I talk to friends who study comparative politics who are looking at people in more dire situations, anxiety, if your country is in the midst of a civil war, has got to be a different thing, like the kind of anxieties I'm talking about here. To this point about the loop, medical experts, public health officials can track flu outbreaks, flu epidemics, by looking at Google search patterns, right? Where people are Googling symptoms is where the outbreak's coming. It's because their anxiety is causing them to, do their own research, and then you can trace those patterns to where it's happening. Are we caught in this loop again and again and again? The hopeful bit I have is this finding that I mentioned, that we're more drawn to people who have policy solutions than people who just want to offer up more threat. So that's a hopeful bit. But I don't want to say, okay, and then the loop's over. I mean, Peopleson's ad from my youth still works, right? When I try it today in experiments, it's still able to, so we haven't resolved that anxiety. They're accessible and can be created for a politician who wants to do it. So, yeah, not a satisfying answer, but those are some thoughts.
Chris?
So I guess questions about the other ways to frame the treatment lenses. So you look at sort of one of the premises we started with is uninformed, but I'm wondering if people who are better informed going in, like, when they receive the anxiety spike, are less
Yeah, that's both those questions I think are so good, and I have to, whether sophistication moderates the effects of the treatment, I don't know. My guess is no, but it's mostly from like a personal level. When I teach this stuff to students, I mention, when you're anxious about getting to law school, when you're anxious about the job market, do you know what story is going to be really like? It's going to stick. It's the kid who got the scales change now, right? It's not 170 or what is it still 170? Something that would be like an awesome score that would get you an that story of the kid who had like 4.0 and a great score, but then didn't get in. Like, you're going to be obsessed with that story. You are drawn to threatening information, and you're going to remember it. And in some ways, you're an expert, right? You're as motivated and able and as expert on your own situation. But, oh my gosh, graduate students with the job market. I mean, there's just threat everywhere, right? But they are really, really good at knowing the threatening information. And so that's a very personal story, but it suggests to me, I think it's interesting, though, to think about differences in sophistication and whether that moderates who we turn to trust. We did do racial differences. So in another paper, we looked at racial differences and anxiety about immigration. And so I think sophistication would be another good moderator to bring in.
What did you find?
On racial differences, so just to take it a step further, in this study we had a control condition, the non-affective ad, and then two treatments. Anxiety in the way that you just saw it, right? Kind of the Pete Wilson ad. And then the other one was drawn from our bottom-up manipulations where we get people to thought list. There we found when people generate anxieties, they tend to generate things like immigrants are taking our jobs. But then some people generated these worries, immigrants being detained, right? They generated worries on behalf of immigrants. And so we created this second commercial or campaign ad that was anxiety on behalf of immigrants themselves. That one didn't exist, or we couldn't find it. Anti-immigrant ads, you can find them all over YouTube. That one we kind of made our own, and we had this joke before, because we got big effects off of it. Like, if political science doesn't work out for us, maybe we should go into... we got white Democrats and Latinos to become more supportive of immigrant right type policies. And we got white Republicans to become, they responded more to the Pete Wilson ad, which makes sense. African Americans also responded more to the Pete Wilson type ad in terms of more denial in that condition. What was interesting to us about that is that, politicians will tell us to feel anxious, but then whether we do or not is in part going to depend upon who we are and our attitudes, right? Some of us can buffer and some of us won't. Now, in terms of the veracity of the threat, so UT just had its third case of the mumps. This scares me. And it suggests to me that the veracity of the threat, gosh, do I want that to work? Do I want that to moderate? But people are worried about vaccines, and they're not worried about the mumps, or whooping cough, and we can show them all the science, but we still see these pockets. And this gets back to your earlier question. These pockets of people who are saying, I'm not going to vaccinate, I'm not going to... They're popping up in pretty educated places. So...
I don't think that those things are necessarily the same. More educated people are less prone to making bad decisions. Like those are two separate things. There are people who are better at
a sweet spot of...
people who are like, those people are good at what this is and knowledge more
this loop.
It seems as if their analysis of the history of political risk to Does that make sense?
It does. I'm trying to think if I
But
have
the
a...
CDC doesn't do anxiety. They join the CDC.
So they were one of the most trusted. So that's good. Or at least that makes me feel good. On the other hand, I do worry that, oh my gosh, everything's political, right? So much of the government, parts that we think of traditionally as nonpartisan, now have strong elements of partisanship to them, at least in terms of how Americans view them and who trusts them and who doesn't. So I want to think that there's hope for an apolitical, trusted, worthy body that we could turn to. But the way that partisanship is creeping into evaluations,
What happens when it is the existence of the federal government itself that increases anxiety?
then drop trust, right? So we didn't do the economy, but
We're here in Texas, though.
right.
We got the Texas Guard keeping an eye on the feds.
That's right.
Right. So we always have that example in Texas. But beyond Texas, you can track, and this is a piece of the theory I didn't mention just because we did do a study on the economy and we ended up not folding it into the book. But if you're anxious about the economy and you think it's the government's fault, quite sensibly, you're not going to put your faith in the government. You're trusting the government to resolve that threat, right? They did it. It's their... on the flip side, and I don't know, gosh, do I not know policy? I can at least speculate, though, that it's not always the government's fault. Sometimes it's the government's fault when we get in foreign policy crises. And yet, in the mass public, if we are threatened on foreign policy, our immediate effect is to rally around the government. So, again, knowledge maybe moderating our coping strategies there. And we, in part, are being tautological here, right? We think people will trust in experts. We see they trust the CDC and then say the CDC is expert. I think it's reasonable the way we've laid out the agencies to say the ones that are trusted more are the expert ones, but it does open the door towards some, which one was it? Department of Homeland Security. There's a boost in trust with Department of Homeland Security, and we see that, and then afterwards we think, oh, okay, well that kind of makes sense in this way. So I take your point there, and I think it's a good one. On the other hand, we do manipulate. You see how I'm dodging giving you a clean answer on what an expert is? It's really hard. Okay, but with the Surgeon General, she's either a political appointee or she's an expert. And they're backed by her MD, right? And we list kind of her medical accomplishments. And she's more trusted when she has that attached to her. Beyond that, I should say it's my co-author, my next dodge. Shayna did the RWJ Fellowship, Robert Wood Johnson, where they get them to learn about public health. And oh my goodness, is it an easier place in public health to distinguish between experts and non-experts? It's still not uncontroversial, but in public health they have agreed upon best practices. And when we take it to immigration, we have more ambiguity, right? What are best practices in immigration?
But just to be clear, though, in the health example that we're talking about, it did seem, unless I was misreading your chart, that people were gravitating towards organizations, not people. Like Oprah is not trusted, but the CDC is. And I'm betting most Americans know nobody by name who works at the CDC or the NIH. Mm-hmm. Right? So is it that they're gravitating towards the organization who has a reputation for knowing what they're talking about?
It's distributed throughout the expertise level.
Yeah, they're going for all the acronyms.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Not individuals, but organizations.
Right, and the acronyms, the acronyms are there to make it easier to present. This gets to low levels of information in the American public, Center for Disease Control, Friends in the Medical Field, like everything was spelled out, everything was...
Right, but what I'm saying is that when you ask Americans, who do you turn to in these situations, they might not turn toward the President Obama because they have biases about that individual. They might have biases about Oprah. They might have biases about the Surgeon General, who's a political appointee. They're less likely to have biases about an agency like the CDC.
I see.
Because they don't attach any individuals to that.
Okay.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so.
Right, but also, I mean, the treatment effects are distributed throughout the expertise of this, right? Am I reading that correctly? I mean, like, the circled ones are the ones with Citizenship.
Yes.
And you arraign the experts according to your total judgment about their...
Yeah, mean differences, like the top ones are the most trusted, collapsed across conditions.
Right, like the treatment effect isn't clustered over the top. It's
Right.
There's no reason for the trust the Fed without process.
No. Well, and we wanted to include some things that are people just going to trust indiscriminately because they're anxious, or are they...
It makes sense that they wouldn't trust those.
Yes, we hoped they wouldn't, and then they didn't. So that was good.
Jack Halliburton, please.
I tried and argued with a lot of cases. And when you start preparing, you have a great fear of the unknown. Because there's so much about facts, and hopefully not the law, but be able to put those things together. So how do you reduce the anxiety? Preparation and knowledge. Do you need to go to experts? If somebody around knows more than you, get to it. How do you gauge that? Well, look at a CV. Has that person got some kind of international knowledge? Recognize only that. At the same time, draw analogies. If you've ever played in the NFL, don't you think you haven't, neither have I. But you've probably done something in a sporting contest. Competitiveness. And so you're afraid. And maybe you're nauseated. You get that first hit, it's all gone. You don't have time anymore to worry about anxiety. You are in the arena. And I put all of that together, irrespective of the subject. And get with it. And be positive. Think clearly. You may not win because you're not going to be the decider. But you do everything you can to get prepared. And the same way with Ebola, on that, we've all probably heard of Ebola for years. But were there mistakes made? Yes, because people lied. People always lie on that. So you've got to be able to lie very well. They're going to cover their lies. So starting with immigration and all, go back to the beginning. How'd they get here? They break the law? A lot of them have. Don't feel sorry for them. Say, get out of here. We're going to put you in jail. Or we're going to prosecute you. Well, you're separating the families. No, we're not. You did. See, what I'm saying is that don't let somebody hoodwink you, though, or make you feel sorry for them. If they're not old enough to know better, they better have some parents that decided, I'm going to have an anchor baby. I've now got some kind of a labor pain, so I'm going to run across the river here. So not only will you be an American citizen, but I can use your kite. So that's what I'm saying is sit back, analyze it, and you can sympathize, but you don't subsidize. That's my message.
Okay.
So you have a pep talk for the American people. You have a pep talk for the American people.
Spoken like a former federal prosecutor.
It was.
Next, I have Sandy.
I'm interested in the relationships between anxiety and you mentioned earlier about the anxiety of graduate students. So one of my favorite examples using them highly intelligent people. But the fact is that in choosing dissertation topics, they're not at all rational. If they were rational, they would choose a subject which they know to be a salient subject, so that more publishers would be interested in publishing it, because that's the way to get eminent exposure. But they don't do it. These are the sort of highly intelligent people. That's a pretty straightforward, rational judgment to make. And they have all the information. Relating this to another issue, climate change. We're interested in this because there's a short-term and a long-term perspective. People are anxious about it. But in the short term, they might think that it's better for economic growth not to worry too much about it because it's an existing thing and doesn't really affect them. But other people who take a different view and think that take the impact on future generations into account. So the basic lecture here about what is rational. I mean, there are two different views here that take about that, which would relate to the anxiety they have about people.
I think with your grad student example, I'm gonna push back just a little bit and create maybe some room for the graduate student to write the unmarketable.
He's a former editor of the University Press, by the way.
So, my dissertation was on religion and politics, and oh my goodness, did my chair say don't do that. He said, that's not going to go well for you. But luckily for me, he also said his view of the dissertation chair was, his metaphor was curling. He said he was the guy with the broom. It's lucky for me.
By the way, my dissertation was about immigration. The dissertation chair said you absolutely can't do that. It's a non-topic, a non-issue. Nobody will read it. Nobody's interested.
Yeah, no one, clearly. Clearly no one's interested in religion and politics or immigration, right? But, they're
He's one of the top people in the field.
They're making calculations in part on what they think will get you a job, but they're also knowing that this is in some ways a thankless task, right? You have low prospects for employment. You have years and years of doing it. If you were to approach the decision perfectly rationally, you'd do something else. Right?
Well, the same American history, everybody knows it. The Civil War itself as well. So if student American history really makes sense for you, especially like in the Civil War. You get plenty of publishing. It's
but not the ones that will get you tenure. I'm quite serious.
And then climate change is a really interesting one to me. I just had a paper come out on persuasion and climate change, because how do you get people to care about climate change when we often see the effects as remote, as distant from us? And we're getting more and more clues that maybe they're not that distant. But I am really surprised, speaking of publishing, that we got this one published, because it's for the most part a big non-finding. We tried to persuade people on climate change, and we failed, except high knowledge people. So in that experiment, we separate by how much knowledge they have around climate change policies, and it's among the high knowledge people that we were able to get movement. For me, the follow-up off of that is, can you bring knowledge levels up more generally? And I'm not. I started out as optimistic.
There's even questions about who are the experts and which one should be regarded as.
I know.
Very controversial.
Do you see? I mean, John Oliver had this thing on climate change on his. I know. I started out with John Oliver saying I could never show him in class. There's too much profanity, and then I got over it because he does a nice job illustrating lots and lots of important political things. And one of them was the climate change debate, where he kind of skewers this idea of point counterpoint by having 98 scientists who support, say this is thing that's happening, and 2 doubters, right? And so it's not point counterpoint, it's 98 points and 2 counterpoints. How do you get...
I don't agree with your statistics at all.
It's actually more like 100% on my side.
How does the anxiety of trusted authority affect In other words, this is sort of Mr. Spock versus Mr. McCoy. Well, I know that's a very retro reference, but are people attracted to, not only do they go to someone they trust, but do they go to someone they trust who's as anxious as they are? Or they go, okay, Captain Scully, all of a sudden the hero is just totally cool. Or do you go to the guy who's waving his hands and did your research show any difference in that?
That's really interesting. I don't have any differences in that. But at the same time, I want to push back and say, do we see that variation in our politicians? Or do our politicians always offer us the calm, cool, collective?
I don't think they ever offer. But some of these issues, Obama has been accused of being too cool, right? And being disengaged. And some people like myself may find that very attractive. But obviously there are other people who don't like that, but you don't share my anxiety, so you're obviously not the person to consult.
Right. Right, and I don't have anything on variation on the emotionality of leaders themselves. So if you don't think they're calm, cool, and collected, they're also not visibly anxious in front of us, right? Our politicians? I'm trying to think of...
Texas now, so...
Right. Fair enough.
Maybe I haven't paid enough attention.
Fair enough.
So I had a cue. Starting with you, sir.
I was picking up on when Jack was talking about Ebola. When I was watching the public service announcements, because my wife was a nurse in Ebola, and she was going, all they suggest is that we duct tape the uniform, and that'll protect us. But I noticed that every time they talked about the head of CDC, they made a point to say, well, he's served under this administration and that administration. And so I think the idea was that just like Earl Alexander, who was the head of Federal Bureau of Prisons under 5 different presidents, would point out, I've served under all these presidents. The idea to create trust by taking away the partisanship issue.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if that might have an impact on moving the needle, because somebody talked about attaching an individual to the organization. But I think CDC has been pretty good about maybe behaving like that as opposed to
No, I think there's something there, right? That maybe these organizations can stay insulated from partisan politics, and that they have to in order to be trusted across administrations, across circumstances.
Hi, I work for the Republican Party in Texas, so I found this study interesting, this lecture interesting. But one question, I just wanted to go back to the racial study that you had. You had mentioned that the Latino community of the Hispanics supported more of the videos that were pro-immigrant rights. But did you find any indication on which party they might trust to deal? Because like in that chart earlier, you mentioned that both Democrats and Republicans to trust the Republican Party. Did you all measure for that?
Right. I don't think we got differences on trust. I think we got just policy attitudes from Latinos in that study. We did try, if you cut, I broke apart whites by partisanship, and I didn't talk about partisanship with African Americans or Latinos, and it's because we didn't have a large enough sample. So I didn't get, there just wasn't enough variation within the Latino sample or the African American sample to look at partisan differences.
You compare this. So I know you're an American, but I mean, are you familiar with the literature about anxiety in politics across nationally? Are there some societies where this is much more acute than other societies? I actually have a graduate student at UC say anything. Is there literature?
There is literature. Some of it we reference. We're learning.
Should be quite a few studies.
Yeah, there's certainly, I mean, political psychology has a really strong tradition in Europe. And so there's work there on emotions and trust for sure. And there's also literature looking at emotion and intergroup conflict that's situated mostly in Europe.
Well, I know some of the people who've done well this work. So the French are, for some reason, off the charts. Among the most anxious even to question. So, and this is a great conundrum. Why are the French anxious and depressed than other people? So, I think there's a lot that can be done comparatively to try to sort this out. What are the things
I think that's really interesting. And also when you think about, differences in socioeconomic kind of, should we be anxious?
Well, I mean, it's even to the point where it's some kind of French political gene or trait. There's something really wrong with the French, comparatively. So Americans, on the other hand, as I understand it, are not Americans. So we're actually pretty healthy.
Isn't there a period of French Enlightenment, reasons to talk to school?
And I can send you some of the literature. There's some films.
It'd be good to think about, the circumstances across countries, but also the particular histories, right? I'd be interested in knowing if it's the contemporary circumstances that are explaining differences, or if it's some reference to where we were. If we have some baselines we're always thinking back to.
And Hiroki next.
My question is regarding the origin of the study of choice. And so you start with kind of juxtaposing anxiety versus cognition, emotion versus kind of personality. And but hearing your presentation, I think your findings are very similar to rational choice people have found, such as Wikipedia, others. So I'm wondering, is it also two questions? One, what is new finding which rational choice people have not found, or what is your finding that rational choice cannot explain? That's one question. And the second question, is it that similarity comes from? Does it come from the fact that your two issue areas of immigration and climate change, where kind of economic winners and losers are very clear, especially users of that issue are very clear in immigration, somebody who are negatively affected or their jobs. Climate change, those whose job may be affected by the duration of climate change. So they are kind of economic losers, and then rational people may notice the impact of the policy. Therefore, they decide that. I think that this is the standard explanation. So, is it because of the choice of the policy issue area, which means if you do this research on the issue area of, for example, war and terrorism, it doesn't create winners and losers all at once. Then anxiety matters more, emotion matters more.
If emotion matters more when they're
on the issue of war and terrorism, also that's actually frame side, and then the consequences of that one.
Yeah, I guess I want to understand where you're coming from a bit more. To me, Lucia and Zoller aren't rational choice theorists; they're political psychologists.
Yes, their explanation is really how the cognitive mechanism of the personality.
Have you taken place of our life. And that's a good thing, because instead of we have to be using our rational judgment about everything to be able to
We'd be exhausted.
function.
Right.
And so, rational is reserved for, these most important things that we can pay attention to and gather information stuff. But the rest, emotions and stuff.
Yeah, if I could add just a comment on this as well. If you look at the literature on the economics of immigration, studies have been done by others. It's very detailed. It's overwhelming that immigrants are complements and not substitutes. So they're not taking those jobs. But so many people think they're certainly taking those jobs. The empirical evidence is that that's just not a fact. We've got tiny segments of that that actually affected. The ones that are most affected are immigrants. They're the ones who have the most fear, the ones who just came in. They're going to be competing with the ones who are coming behind. But for the vast majority of Americans, there's really no effect. It's actually a positive effect. And that's just, that's the empirical findings of this meeting. So then, the question is, how do you get from there to fear? I mean, that's the essence of politics. It's something you can push those emotional buttons, and you don't have to refer to any scientific literature.
Right, yeah. We're scared of all sorts of things, and are they the right things? I don't know. I don't think so. Our research is agnostic when it comes to the credibility, the reality, what we ought to be scared about, right? We're more interested in taking anxiety where it is and seeing what happens.
Yeah, I took one of my great colleagues and collaborators, a social cultural anthropologist, to an economics seminar. And there was a lot of discussion about rationality and people, the winners and the losers. And she went away from this, and her comment to me was, well, everybody knows rationality is socially constructed. So, I mean, that's the anthropology view, which is, of course, it's all socially constructed.
Yeah.
Okay.
I see a certain analogy here, what else you're saying about immigration and what we were talking about a little bit earlier with global warming. When you see the pressure to sell one point of view by fear, bringing in the anxiety and so forth, you don't necessarily move things in the direction of rationality. In many cases, move things in the direction of pseudoscience. That's why I was saying, for example, I don't interview their statistics of.
It wasn't me. It was John Oliver.
Except a certain view of global warming. Global warming, to me, has become more religion than it has been debate about science, because so much of it has to do with how do you frame the question. What is it you're worried about? We started worrying about one thing defined as global warming, and that didn't work for a while. So now we're talking about climate change. Nobody will disagree. Climate is changing, and changing forever. You have unexpected consequences when you try and use fear and anxiety to sell a particular point of view, and rationality sometimes gets lost.
But the point is not rationality. The point is to get votes. They haven't said where all this is going. The whole point of politics in democratic society is to get votes. And there are a variety of ways of doing it. So, I mean, I don't know how you connect your study to the obvious.
Politicians want to get votes. Interest groups want to get people on board to help push for their cause. Public health officials want to get people vaccinated, right? They all have their idea of where they want to get us, and anxiety can be useful for them to get people there.
Okay, so I had two more before we break. Chris McLeod and Bethany.
From her one, it seemed like you see outcomes related to confirmation bias, selective so another sort of component of confirmation bias is selective
No, we just have the agree, disagree. We don't have anything in terms of how you interpret, or, you read a paragraph and what bit of it is salient. We have which of the stories were particularly salient to you, but not people looking at the same set of text and taking away different pieces as salient. I'm a political psychologist, right? I don't think we're
really scared about terror.
Right. Well, and I tell my students to vote, but I also tell them, oh, this is bad, but it's true. You guys want some rationality. You're more likely to be hit by a car on your way to go vote than you are to have a vote that makes a difference. That is rough, right? Like, I don't want the Texas legislature knowing that I'm telling them that. And when I tell them that, I also make sure that I tell them that I vote, right? I don't make up my mind that way. I vote. And now we can turn it into I vote because it makes me feel good. I vote because I like the sticker. I vote because I know someone died for my right to vote. And therefore it's rational. But at that point, rationality is getting so big and all-encompassing that I just feel like it loses its explanatory value, right?
You make them read Anthony Downs.
Yeah, of course. And there is a study, because I have this, interest in experiments. There's a study in which a professor gave half of his class Downs and half of them not, and he actually depressed turnout in the Downs part. So teach Downs with some caution. I teach Downs, and then I try to, undo the damage a bit.
We had local elections in those elections, your vote actually does.
That's right.
It does, right? And yet we're more likely to vote in those situations when it counts the least.
That's right.
And if I could, this is another, if political science doesn't work out for me, here's the campaign I want to run, which is we need to boost vote turnout in Texas. We're pathetic, right, compared to other states when it comes to vote turnout. Texans love their state. Having lived here for 6-7 years now, there's so much Texas pride. And so here's the slogan: everything's bigger in Texas, except vote turnout.
And yet those local elections probably affect people voting more than...
Yeah.
Well, I once shared an office many years ago with a French fascist. And he was a real fascist.
Did you learn a lot, James?
I never learned as much in my life as I did from sharing an office with this guy. But there was an election, and I asked him, "Did you vote?" And I'll never forget his answer. He said, "My time is not worth 1/19 million." I'm not going to participate in this short.
Yeah. I used to put nickels in front of, when I was a grad student, nickels, quarters, and pennies in front of my faculty's office doors. This is twisted, but it's true. Because there was a study about is it worth your time to bend over and pick up? Anyway.
Well, for students in the room, it's not okay to conduct experiments on your professors. For the record.
We can do it to you, but you can't do it to them.
That's right. This only works in one direction. But please join me in thanking Dr. Albertson.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. See how much fun political science can